In 6th place in extemporaneous speaking, from Belleville West, Bethany Dane. In 5th place, Vinesh Basti from Hinsdale Central. In 4th place, from Wheaton Warrenville South, Tyler McSannick. And I think you guys are going to find this one really interesting. This is a rare event. Well, there is a tie, and there's a tie for 1st place. A 3-way unbreakable tie, so we have 3 state champions. All right, so let's recognize each one of them by name. First of all, we don't have 3 first place medals, so we're going to give them a 3rd place and a 2nd place medal, but they will all get a 1st place medal. So in 1st place from the Illinois Math and Science Academy, Vinesh Kanaan. From Huntley High School, Parth Patel. And from Nequa Valley, Samaya Jain. All right, here's what we're going to do. So guys, we're going to have all 3 of you perform, but what we're going to do is we're going to kind of intersperse it throughout the awards. So we'll have somebody perform now, and a few speeches later you'll see a 2nd extemp, and just as we're getting to the end of awards, a 3rd extemp state champion. All right, so we're going to start with your state champion from the Illinois Math and Science Academy, Vinesh Kanaan. Champion in extemporaneous speaking, number 1, Vinesh Kanaan.
A solid turns into a liquid. It is then able to fill the shape of the container that it occupies. That's when it dissolves. So now let's take a monetary policy lesson. When a bank is considered to be liquid, that means it has enough money to spend on loans. Unfortunately, the problem with these 2 descriptions, solid and liquid, is that neither accurately portrays the Eurozone. And this group of states, all of whom are united under the euro currency, can't even be considered to be solid because so many nations have individual public debts. And their banks aren't liquid either. In fact, a report published by the European Central Bank on January 14th shows that the deficit between the amount of money and assets that European banks actually have and the values of the loan they paid out is strong at 42 billion euros. Regardless of this, it would be nice if Europe could get some solvency. But that's not the sort of dissolution that bankers and politicians are talking about when they wonder, will the euro be dissolved in 2014? And the answer to this is a clear no. European leaders know that this would be a bad move for 3 important reasons. First of all, the economies of Europe depend on each other and a common currency for growth. Second, the dissolution of the euro would hurt confidence across the economies. And finally, European leaders have already established a commitment to making necessary reforms to keep the currency. But the first reason that we won't see the euro dissolved, at least not in 2014, is because the economies of Europe depend on each other and a common currency for growth. In the interest of multidisciplinarity, we'll take a history lesson now. After World War I, the economies of Europe were struggling to revitalize themselves. And one of the most important moves they took was to drop trade regulations, making it easier for commodities and products to be traded between nations. But in addition, they formed the Eurozone, creating an overarching currency known as the euro. And that eliminated the tasking problem of currency exchanges, which were not only time-consuming, but often came with transactions that could hurt economic growth. Today, having these barriers dropped in a common currency is a beneficial source of growth for Europe. According to a New York Times report from February 14th, Ulster Steel, one of the most powerful steel companies across all of Europe, is expecting a 2.5% increase in demand in this coming year. A demand statistic that would likely be cut if the European currency were not around to ease deals. But even entire countries have benefited from this as well. The Eurozone economy of Germany is regarded as a manufacturing hub, and over the past month, they saw a 9.2% increase in car exports. Those are bought by countries like France, another example of interconnection in the Eurozone. In that same month, the New York Times also reported that France's gross domestic product grew by 0.3%, something that may not have been possible without an overarching currency to help ease trade deals for them. Unfortunately, this is not always true across all European economies, and that's why the euro needs to stay in place. According to a February 14th report from the Organization for Economic Collaboration and Development, the difference between potential output and actual output in countries like Italy, Portugal, and Spain is 3.8%. The easiest way to allow them to have freer trade and close that gap is to have a united currency. But another reason why the euro won't be dissolved in 2014 is because that sort of action would hamper confidence across all parts of the economy. And this is because having a united currency and an organization to govern it, the European Central Bank, is beneficial to confidence. A report published by the European Central Bank on February 10th shows that it engages in something that most people and businessmen haven't been doing lately: buying bonds from governments and banks. This is one of the surest indicators of confidence because it means that banks trust political and financial institutions enough to credit their stability and commitment to reforms by purchasing their bonds and giving them money in turn. That's important because it frees up money that can then be loaned out. Businesses take this money and they then use it to expand themselves and hire more employees, crucial to the growth of the Eurozone. An article published by The Telegraph on February 14th shows that this has already had a positive effect in countries like Italy, where over the last month, unemployment dropped from 12.8% to 12.7%. Though this is a meager statistic, it is a positive sign of how things work. And frankly, if the European Central Bank were not united under a currency that would allow it to take these confidence-boosting measures, no one would. But the Eurozone and the euro will not be dissolved in 2014 because Europe's leaders, at least as far as we can trust them, have already made a commitment to creating the necessary financial reforms to keep their currency. The first of these fall under the category of monetary reforms, to the ways that loan and currency are taken out. According to a European Central Bank report from February 10th, the first of these is known as the European Banking Union, which will give the European Central Bank control to regulate many of the banks across Europe. And those banks contributed to the problem with Eurozone in the first place. Many of them made bad loans that they didn't have the assets or money to take, and those loans had little chance of being paid back. Now, keeping the euro currency and the ability to regulate those banks allows the European Central Government to prevent people from making bad loans and put stress tests on how much money that they actually have. Another important reform that European leaders are making comes in terms of fiscal policy, how much money that governments spend and take in. An article published by the New York Times on February 12th shows that this is happening in France with a commitment from President François Hollande. And that's particularly important because France is socialist. So they suffer from problems like public debt and too much spending, particularly in their pension system, where the article estimates that there is an $18 billion deficit. It's important that François Hollande is now making commitments to change these, and it's a sign that people in countries like Germany, who help run the Eurozone, look at, because without an overarching currency to provide the impetus for these reforms, there may be no way of regulating poor government and banking decisions. And for France, President Hollande knows that this is an important measure for him, because if he didn't have the European Central Bank buying his government's bond and frankly keeping their economy alive, the time may have already passed to make the necessary changes. The question, will the euro be dissolved in 2014, is just whispered in the halls of the European Central Bank and at monthly meetings of the Financial Enthusiasts Club. And that's because it's a rather dumb one. The euro will not be dissolved, at least not in 2014, because Europe's leaders are confident of, first of all, that the European countries and economies are connected and depend upon each other for growth. Second, that dissolving the euro would hurt private confidence. And finally, because those leaders have already committed to making the reforms necessary to keep the currency. Rather than dissolve it, it may not allow it to be a solid or liquid, at least in the terms of economic growth. But Europe's leaders know that any alternative would simply be passing gas.